If you zoom into the middle of the parched Arizona desert on Google Earth, you'll see something that makes absolutely no sense. Massive neon green circular fields stretching across the sand. In a region where summer temperatures cross 115 degrees, these alien landscapes are drinking more groundwater than entire cities. But if you follow the paper trail of who owns this green oasis, you won't find local American farmers. You'll find a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire half a world away. They are legally mining America's most precious resource for free, shipping across the ocean and leaving local towns to literally die of thirst. This is the story of how a 70-year-old legal loophole turned a desert survival crisis into a corporate heist. An historic, high-stakes legal war trying to stop it before the entire American West runs completely dry. The day the faucets went silent, the silence that follows a failing water system is a terrifying reality growing across rural Arizona. In the arid landscapes of La Paz and Maricopa counties, small communities like Wendon, Salome, and the outskirts of Kingman are witnessing an unprecedented ecological emergency. For generations, residents relied on shallow domestic wells to draw clean, cold water from deep underground aquifers. Today, those same homeowners turn their kitchen faucets only to hear a hollow, metallic rattle followed by a violent sputtering of air and brown sediment. The aquifer has been sucked completely dry. When a private residential well fails, it triggers an immediate and catastrophic unraveling of families' financial stability. In these rural stretches of the Sun Belt, homes are entirely dependent on independent groundwater access. Unlike urban properties tied to massive municipal water grids, a rural property without an active well is legally uninhabitable and financially worthless. The cost to drill a replacement well has skyrocketed to $20,000, $30,000, or even $50,000 because the water table has dropped so low that heavy machinery must penetrate thousands of feet into the bedrock. For the average working-class family, this expense is an absolute impossibility. Consequently, proud homeowners watch their single largest lifetime investment evaporate into thin air. The daily routine shifts from normal domestic life into a desperate, exhausting logistical struggle for basic human survival. Entire neighborhoods are now forced to depend on charity-driven volunteer networks that deliver heavy pallets of plastic water jugs and bulk storage tanks. In the blistering heat of the American desert, where missing a single day of hydration can be fatal, citizens are living like refugees within their own country, hauling water by hand just to wash dishes, flush toilets, and survive the day. The ghost towns of the Sun Belt. This crisis is not confined to a few isolated homesteads. Its geographic footprint is expanding with terrifying speed across the wider Sun Belt. Hydrogeological data reveals that groundwater levels in Arizona's unregulated basins are plummeting by as much as 20 to 30 feet every single year. For decades, the Sun Belt has been celebrated as America's premier growth engine, drawing millions of new residents with the promise of cheap land, constant sunshine, and sprawling suburban developments. However, this explosive growth is colliding with a hard physical reality. In municipal zones, strict laws require developers to prove an assured 100-year water supply before a single brick is laid. But in unincorporated areas, clever developers have utilized legal workarounds to keep the boom going. The most notorious mechanism is known as wildcat lot splitting. By breaking large tracts of land into fewer than 6 parcels, developers can completely bypass state consumer protection laws and avoid proving that their new homes have a secure, long-term water source. As a direct result, thousands of rapid-fire housing developments have risen on top of fragile, finite aquifers that are already severely overallocated. The local real estate markets in these vulnerable zones are beginning a quiet, devastating collapse. Buyers are fleeing. Banks are refusing mortgages on properties without secure water rights, and long-term economic planning has ground to a halt. The fundamental contradiction of the modern Southwest is becoming undeniable. A society can easily construct thousands of miles of roads and houses, but it cannot manufacture the water required to sustain them. The green spot in the middle of the desert, from high above the earth, satellite imagery reveals a stark and bewildering anomaly in the landscape of the Southwest. Amidst the arid, sun-bleached expanse of the Arizona desert, where summer temperatures regularly cross 115 degrees Fahrenheit, sit massive, perfectly circular fields of vibrant neon green. These are mega-industrial alfalfa farms, operating on a scale that defies the natural limitations of the environment. Alfalfa is one of the most water-intensive crops in existence, requiring a continuous, massive deluge of moisture to survive the brutal desert evaporation rates. These corporate agricultural operations consume far more water on a daily basis than the surrounding residential towns and cities combined. A closer look at the deeds to these lands reveals an unsettling truth. The traditional, local generational farmers who once managed the land sustainably have been systematically priced out. In their place stand multi-billion-dollar foreign agricultural conglomerates and Wall Street private equity funds. These institutional investors did not buy thousands of acres of remote desert dirt because they fell in love with farming. They bought the land because they understood that the true, unpriced asset lay hundreds of feet beneath the surface. They bought the land to gain total control over the liquid gold hidden below, turning a public resource into a private treasury. The 1953 loophole, pumping for free, the ability of corporate titans to drain the desert relies entirely on a foundational flaw within state legal frameworks. While urban centers in Arizona are governed by strict groundwater management acts passed in 1980, vast stretches of the state remain classified as unregulated basins. In these zones, water tracking dates back to an archaic legal doctrine cemented in 1953, known formally as a rule of absolute ownership, more colloquially referred to as a law of the biggest pump. Under this antiquated system, groundwater is not treated as a shared public trust or a finite communal resource. Instead, whoever owns a piece of surface land possesses an absolute, unrestricted right to pump as much water from beneath that property as their machinery can physically extract. There are no limits on volume, no financial charges per gallon, and virtually zero state oversight or reporting requirements. This creates a literal race to the bottom of the aquifer. A multi-billion-dollar corporation can afford to drill massive, industrial-grade wells thousands of feet deep, installing high-powered pumps that run 24 hours a day. As these corporate megawells operate, they create a phenomenon known as a cone of depression, actively drawing water away from the surrounding landscape. The shallow, modest wells of local homeowners and small-scale farmers are left high and dry, completely powerless against the superior mechanical and financial might of industrial entities. Shipping American water to the Sahara, this legal vulnerability has opened the floodgates for a bizarre and deeply damaging global economic pipeline. The most egregious example of this exploitation is embodied by Anomaly, a multi-billion-dollar dairy conglomerate based in Saudi Arabia. To understand why a Middle Eastern corporation is farming in the middle of the American Southwest, one must look at the environmental collapse of the Arabian Peninsula. After decades of intensive, unregulated agricultural pumping, Saudi Arabia effectively depleted its own ancient, non-renewable aquifers. Realizing that the kingdom was running out of drinking water, the Saudi government enacted a strict ban on the domestic cultivation of water-intensive crops like alfalfa, which is vital for feeding their massive commercial dairy herds. Instead of downsizing their operations, Anomaly executives scanned the globe for vulnerable legal systems and identified Arizona's unregulated basins. Through a subsidiary, the corporation purchased thousands of acres of desert land in La Paz County, often leasing it from the state land department for incredibly low rates. Because of the 1953 loophole, Anomaly began pumping billions of gallons of pristine groundwater without paying a single dime to the state or local communities. They used this American water to grow massive yields of alfalfa, harvest crop, pack it into shipping containers, and transport across the ocean back to Saudi Arabia. It is a system of virtual water exportation, where a foreign nation successfully preserves its own natural resources by systematically exhausting the water supply of American citizens, all executed entirely within the boundaries of law. The price of political silence. The continuation of this clear ecological plunder raises a critical question. Why has the state government allowed its own citizens to be systematically dehydrated? The answer lies within the entrenched structures of political power and deep-seated institutional inertia. For decades, the industrial agricultural sector has wielded immense, disproportionate influence over the state legislature. Mega farms, corporate landowners, and agricultural lobbying groups dump millions of dollars into political campaigns, political action committees, and targeted public relations efforts designed to frame any form of groundwater regulation as an unconstitutional threat to private property rights. This relentless lobbying has successfully paralyzed any legislative attempts to modernize the state's archaic water codes. Year after year, common-sense bills aimed at establishing mandatory well metering or creating localized groundwater management districts are quietly strangled in committee rooms before they can ever reach a floor vote. State regulators and politicians consistently choose to look the other way, intentionally prioritizing short-term agricultural revenue and corporate profits over the long-term existential survival of their constituents. The political class has effectively decided that economic metrics on a quarterly balance sheet are more valuable than ensuring that future generations of citizens have liquid flowing from their kitchen taps. The looming domino effect. It is a grave mistake to view the unfolding disaster in Arizona as an isolated, localized anomaly. In reality, the corporate exploitation of the Southwest serves as a highly successful proof of concept, a blueprint that is already being replicated across the American West. Wall Street private equity firms, sovereign wealth funds, and international investment syndicates are quietly executing a massive, coordinated land grab across drought-prone states like New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and the Central Valley of California. Institutional investors have realized that in an era of accelerating climate instability and shifting weather patterns, traditional financial assets like stocks and bonds carry significant volatility. Fresh water, however, is a non-negotiable prerequisite for human life, industry, and agriculture. It has become the premier commodity of the 21st century, openly referred to by financial elites as blue gold. By purchasing agricultural land that sits atop unregulated or loosely monitored aquifers, these financial entities are effectively speculation trading on human survival. They are betting that as water becomes increasingly scarce, their control over the remaining subterranean reserves will yield unprecedented financial leverage and astronomical profits. If these antiquated, easily manipulated legal frameworks are not aggressively dismantled, the systematic corporate draining of local communities will cease to be an exception and will instead become the standard operating procedure for the entire western half of the United States. Reclaiming the aquifer. Halting this trajectory before the damage becomes entirely irreversible demand a radical, unyielding overhaul of how society values and regulates its most precious liquid resource. The path toward reclaiming the aquifers must begin with the immediate legislative termination of antiquated legal loopholes like the rule of absolute ownership. Corporate entities must be stripped of the absurd privilege to extract public groundwater without financial compensation or regulatory oversight. State governments must mandate strict, transparent electronic metering on all high-capacity industrial and agricultural wells, forcing corporations to account for every single gallon drawn from the earth. Furthermore, the legal paradigm itself must shift away from viewing water as a mere real estate asset to be bought, sold, and liquidated by the highest bidder. Instead, fresh water must be explicitly codified into law as a fundamental, non-negotiable human right, and a sacred public trust that cannot be commodified or exported for foreign corporate gain. The physical consequences of inaction are already manifesting as massive fissures crack open the desert floor, a structural collapse of the land itself caused by the hollowed-out spaces below. The time for incremental policy tweaks and political hand-wringing has expired. The public is now faced with a stark, defining choice. State citizens can either mobilize to aggressively protect the basic ecological survival of their communities, or they can stand by silently as the literal lifeblood of the American nation is drained away, packed into shipping containers, and sold off to global entities.